Good afternoon. I had to catch myself. I didn't say good morning because that's what I'm used to saying. My name is Chris Heron. I'm the senior pastor here at Lowcountry, and we're so excited that you're here, delighted that you've joined us this afternoon, that you've been dragged away from NFL games or whatever other sports events are on. So this is going to be much better, much more enriching. So I'm glad you're here. Hopefully you know the bathrooms are in the back. Before you exit, actually to the right, there's some bathrooms back there should you need them. And I'm sure Jonathan will give you any other directions you need. He felt that because we're talking about the faith of Pat Conroy that I could open us with prayer. So that's what I'm going to do. So let us pray. We know, oh God, that you can speak to us through your word, through others, through music and art and literature. We who have been enriched by Pat Conroy's extraordinary gift of storytelling and exquisite use of language have the opportunity now to learn about his faith in you that no doubt permeated his writings. Give us open hearts and minds that as we hear of his faith, our faith will be deepened. Amen. Our presenters, Jonathan Haupt and Holland Perryman, will be introduced this afternoon by Savannah Epps, a sixth grader at Bluffton's River Ridge Academy. This past summer, Savannah participated in the Conroy Center's annual Camp Conroy for young writers and artists. And next summer, she will be Camp Conroy's first ever junior counselor. So please welcome Savannah Epps.
The grandson of a Methodist minister, Jonathan Haupt, is executive director of the nonprofit Pat Conroy Literary Center in Beaufort. He is the former director of the University of South Carolina Press, where he created the story River Book's Southern fiction imprint with his friend and mentor, Pat Conroy. A frequent book reviewer and author interviewer for the Charleston Post and Courier and the Southern Review of Books, Mr. Haupt is also co-editor of the anthology Our Prince of Scribes, Writers Remember Pat Conroy, winner of 17 book awards. In 2020, he was honored with the Doug Marlett Award for Literacy Leadership presented by the Pulpwood Queens, the largest book club in the United States. The daughter of a Presbyterian minister, Holland Perryman, became the Conroy Center's first intern when she was 14 years old. Holland is now a senior at Beaufort High School, where she is student body president, captain of the girls' varsity lacrosse team, and founding president of DALO, the Diversity Awareness Youth Literacy Organization. She is also winner of the Ann Head Literary Prize for short story fiction and the first writer to be featured twice in the Lowcountry Poets Corner segment of ETV's author interview series, By the River. Holland has also reviewed books and interviewed writers for the Charleston Post and Courier, the Southern Review of Books, and Beaufort's Lowcountry Weekly. Please welcome Jonathan Haupt and Holland Perryman.
That's the best introduction I've ever been given. Thank you so much.
I like the part that she remembered to introduce me. Yes. Thank you all. We should have sat farther away so you would have had to applaud longer. I didn't think through that part. Good afternoon, everyone. Oh, I bet we can do a little better than that. Let's try an experiment. Yes. Can we get a little more volume on my microphone? No? All right. Can I get a little closer to my microphone? Is that better? Yes. We feeling good about that, audience? I guess so, maybe. All right. So Mr. Conroy, who is a dear friend of mine, would end all of his correspondence and his phone calls with two words, two very simple words. But when they came from Pat Conroy, they were somehow empowering and inspirational. And since we're in this beautiful Lowcountry Presbyterian Church this afternoon, I thought we might honor this space by saying those words together. What are those words, Holland?
What are those words?
Thank you for asking. I appreciate that. Great love. That's how Mr. Conroy would end everything. So how about on three? Three, Savannah? Three. Can we say great love all together? 1, 2, 3.
Great love.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Very kind of you. So this talk, The Faith of Pat Conroy, began by way of a request I got from the Chautauqua Society of Athens, Georgia. They asked if I could put together a talk about Mr. Conroy that I had not given before, and there are quite a few that I do. And I immediately said The Faith of Pat Conroy because it was a subject that was very near and dear to me. And very often the best way to learn more about something is to teach that thing, then you become accountable to an audience for that. So Holland and I have given this talk, I've forgotten how many times. How many times have we done this together?
Like one, two?
One time, yes. So this is the second time. This is the encore. And I appreciate you being our audience for that. So what are we actually going to talk about, Holland?
So Pat Conroy's books have some very clear themes that run throughout them. Like, he writes about them very vividly, and it's easy to pinpoint, like family. So often his books focus on family dynamic or the environment because he so often is musing about the world around him. But one of the themes that's a little more difficult to discern is his faith and how he portrays that through his characters. And like Mr. Haupt said, exploring something like that isn't so clear gives us a better understanding of maybe where we are in our own faith journey. So I'm very excited to be doing this talk again.
Thank you. Well said. So when we say faith, which we're probably going to do a lot during our slightly more than an hour presentation, that's foreshadowing, by the way, we're going to be talking both about spiritual faith, faith in a creator with a capital C, but also in a very humanistic, earthbound faith, faith in humanity, faith in ourselves, and faith in one another. And as Savannah said in the introduction, Mr. Conroy was a mentor to me very late in his life. I knew him for a while, but it was really during the last 5 years of his life that Pat was very close to me and my teacher in the big sense of that word. And he did a couple of really interesting favors for me, and I'll mention them quickly only because they relate to our sensibility of faith and our subject. Pat had the opportunity to write a letter of reference for me when I was transitioning from being a publicist at the University of South Carolina Press to being the publisher. And it was a beautiful, heartfelt, and frankly hilarious letter of recommendation. But I realized years later what Pat was doing was he wasn't writing that letter for the person he was sending it to. He was writing it for me. He was trying to show me in that letter who he thought I was and who he thought I was capable of becoming. And I really did not recognize the version of myself that Pat wrote about in that letter of reference. And I think in many ways I'm still trying to become the person Pat thought I already was. So that may be something for you to remember at some point, Holland, if anyone ever writes a letter of reference for you, just saying theoretically. But after I got that job, thanks in part to Pat's letter of reference, he invited me down to Beaufort to go to a celebratory lunch with a bunch of friends, and we had a great time together. But afterwards, Pat decided that he wanted to drive me back to my car, which was parked not very far away. And I realized that he wanted a moment without an audience. He wanted a moment when it was just the two of us together, and he did not have to perform the role of Pat Conroy. And in that car, as I was about to get out, Pat extended his great big lion's paw of a hand to me and motioned for me to sit for a minute. And then he shook my hand and he said, "Jonathan, you and I are going to be friends." And it wasn't just a throwaway line. Pat had no shortage of friends. It was an oath, and it was an oath that I honor by conversations like this, still trying to be that friend and that advocate for Mr. Conroy. But then he said, "I want to try and teach you the way that I was taught. I want you to learn from me if you can. And if you're lucky, as I have been lucky, and if you take these lessons to heart and open your mind to what I have to say, one day, maybe you'll get to tell this story at Lowcountry Presbyterian Church in Bluffton, South Carolina." It's prophetic in its way, because here we are. Most of that story is true. This is why I decided not to stand at the pulpit when you say things like that aren't entirely true. It's better to be pulpit adjacent, I find.
That's a lot of responsibility for
It
me.
is, yes. So that's really all I want to say about me. Holland gets to say more about her a little later in our story, but let's talk about Pat Conroy, which is our actual subject today. Mr. Conroy was the oldest of 7 siblings. His father, Don Conroy, Colonel Don Conroy, the real Great Santini, was born in Chicago and raised Roman Catholic. And the Roman Catholic faith was absolutely essential to Don's upbringing, so much so that Don's brother Jim becomes a priest, Father Jim, and his sister Marge is a sister in both senses of that word. She's a Catholic nun. So this is the world in which Don Conroy grew up and the world in which he wanted his children to grow up as well. Counterpoint to that is Pat's mother, Peg, who grew up in the backwoods, beyond the backwoods, in rural Alabama and Georgia. And Pat would often joke about his snake-handling mother, and it's possible that he was not actually joking, that in her youth she might have gone to a primitive Southern Baptist church where that would have been part of the ritual. But Pat wrote about this a couple of times, and Holland's going to share with us a quote about that, about his mother converting to Roman Catholicism when she married the colonel, and this is from The Death of Santini.
I think my mountain mother, with her upbringing in the primitive Baptist church, believed that converting to Roman Catholicism was a step upward in the social order. Of course, she was wrong. When I grew up in the South, a Roman Catholic was the weirdest thing you could be. There was no second place until the Hare Krishnas showed up with their tambourines and saffron robes in the Atlanta airport.
Pat later gives a sort of fictional version of his mother a chance to offer a rebuttal, her own sort of vision of what all of that meant. And that comes from beach music and the character of Lucy McCall, who is very much based on the real Peg Conroy. Her son Jack McCall sort of takes her to task for converting to Roman Catholicism, and this is her response.
I raised my children in the Cadillac of religions.
Yes, fictional character, but probably speaks to the heart of how the real Peg Conroy felt. Well, our counterpoint to all of that is, of course, the Colonel, Don Conroy, who Pat often referred to as the god of war, evoking Ares from Greek mythology. And in his novel, The Great Santini, Pat gives the fictional version of his dad, Colonel Bull Meacham, a chance to think about Roman Catholicism in relationship to his role in the military. So Holland's going to share that excerpt for us.
Sometimes, Colonel Meacham would think about the relationship of Catholics in the military. Good Catholics make good soldiers, he thought. The soldier has to obey his commanding officer without questioning his orders. Same with the Catholics. God's the commanding officer, and the Pope is his first sergeant. God tells the Pope what he wants done, and the Pope lays down the law. The church is the structure wherein laws are administered. The church and the Pentagon are a lot alike in that respect. I am the commanding officer of the 367. God is the commanding officer of the universe. Both of us have similar responsibilities. O Lord, make me worthy of the squadron I command, and please give me a chance to kill Castro.
So there we have the fictional Bull Meacham equating himself to being God, or at least godlike, by virtue of being the commander of his squadron. And that's Pat giving to a novel, to a fictional character, something he almost certainly heard from his actual father, the real Colonel Conroy. So this is the household in which Pat grew up, with a father who believed himself to be godlike and a mother who had converted to Roman Catholicism and thought it was a great step upward in the social hierarchy. And Pat had a chance at a relatively young age, same age that Savannah is, in fact, to read an interesting collection of stories commonly referred to as the Bible. Perhaps you all have heard of it. And Holland's going to share that excerpt with us.
In 6th grade, under the tutelage of Sister Nathaniel, I decided to read the entire Bible. I thought it would bring me closer to God. It took me 3 years to complete the project, and then my mother was upset that I had read the King James Version of the Bible that Grandpa Peake had given me, instead of the version that was approved by the Catholic Church. By accident, I had read the beautiful Bible, and the magisterial rhythms of King James Version are the ones that still move through my bloodstream.
So that's Pat's introduction to the Bible, to a book that he found absolutely beautiful and powerful. And he's growing up in a household where everything sort of feels mythological. It all feels larger than life, with his parents being the kind of characters that they are. And his mother is reading him poetry, and that too is something that he finds resonating on the pages of the King James Bible as he reads it. So he takes all of this to heart, and Pat, as a young person, is absolutely invested in the Roman Catholic Church. He's an altar boy. He's doing everything he thinks his parents want him to do growing up in this house of faith. And Pat is going to private schools, to Catholic schools as well, until they arrive here in the Lowcountry. 1961, Pat is 16, just a little bit younger than Holland is, and he enrolls at Beaufort High School, first public school he's ever gone to, first time he's ever gone anywhere other than a Catholic school. And things start to happen for Pat at Beaufort High that may not have happened anywhere else, and things start to happen in the Lowcountry that may not have happened anywhere else. And Pat Conroy is carrying the weight of this great secret that he's being physically and verbally abused by his father at home. So he's really been resistant to making friends, to making connections with teachers or anyone else. But at Beaufort High School, all of that starts to change. He comes here, and his father's assignment at the air station is for 2 years. So Pat has both his junior and senior years at Beaufort High School. And with 2 years in one school that's so incredibly welcoming to military kids, as it is to this day, Pat finally starts to make those connections. And he makes a best friend fairly early in his time there, a kid named Randy Randall. Randy is the son of the school superintendent, Morgan Randall, and he is every single thing that Pat Conroy wishes he could be, but is not yet. Randy is tall and handsome and popular and witty and smart. He's athletic. He's a natural leader. Everything that Pat Conroy aspires to be, but does not feel he is capable of being. So Pat becomes a good and loyal sidekick to Randy. But then the great tragedy of Pat's childhood happens. Opening game of the 1962 baseball season, Randy Randall, who is the pitcher for the baseball team, drops dead on the pitcher's mound in front of the whole school, including his father, school superintendent Morgan Randall, who's present that day. An undiagnosed heart condition, an aneurysm. Randy's dead before he hits the ground. And Pat Conroy, who's being beaten by his father, who thinks he himself might die at any point in his life, now knows what it looks like to see a teenage boy die in front of him. Pat, at that point in his life, has a really wonderful mentor who he wrote about quite a bit, Gene Norris, his high school English teacher, a man who is living a life of tremendous service to all of those kids at Beaufort High. And Gene gives Pat, and indeed the whole school, permission to grieve. They have no idea what to do. They've never seen a classmate die before. They're not sure what they're supposed to do. But Gene tells them it's okay to be sad, to miss Randy, and to let that grief take whatever form it needs to be. And for Pat Conroy, it takes the form of a poem, what he always described as the very first poem he ever wrote in memory of his friend, Randy Randall. It's addressed to Randy, but really it's written for Randy's parents, Morgan and Julia Randall. And Holland's going to read it for us.
To Randy Randall, I have ceased to wonder at the rapid flight of days. The slice of birds and winter's shout are but an effort meant to render nature praise. Myself, I wish to think about 100 friends who walk a pathless street alone in search of lost and youth-grieved dreams. Once a boy, fluid-limbed and not quite fully grown, gave love to life, and life it seems, surfeited with the honey tooth of perfect joy. Yet darkness lit another place, far off in the hills. So shadow wrapped the boy in death, and pressed his guiltless face into the flawless pages of eternal rhyme, a snow-fleeced lamb of the earth, and God-bound child of time.
Beautifully read, thank you. That's a pretty amazing first poem, if that was in fact Pat's first poem, but he had a reason to write that. That is, if you listen to the words, that is a nature poem in many ways, but it's also Pat Conroy writing a kind of prayer to God, asking him to allow his friend, Randy Randall, entrance into heaven. That is, if you will, the plot of the poem. And once this poem comes out, once Pat gets a taste for what it's like to put this kind of lyrical beauty on a page, he can't stop. They keep coming. And Pat is writing poetry all throughout his high school and college years. And those poems are being published in the literary magazines at both schools, at Beaufort High School, and then later at the Citadel. So Pat Conroy, for a long time, very much wanted to be a poet, but that poetry begins in a moment of tragedy in honor and memory of his friend, Randy Randall. So Pat leaves Beaufort High School and enrolls in the Citadel on a basketball scholarship. He would not have been able to go to college in the absence of that. And he has a couple of things he's trying to do at the Citadel. One is prove himself to his father, to go 4 years and graduate from a military school when he has absolutely no interest in entering the military, just to prove to himself and his dad that he can do that. But he's also trying to learn what kind of person he could become. And he's had a couple of good role models, and he finds a few more at the Citadel. And the Citadel has at that time, as it does to this day, a very simple honor code, and Pat is very drawn to it. And it's simply this: a cadet does not lie, cheat, or steal, nor tolerate those who do. That is a streamlined version of the Ten Commandments, and very intentionally so. And Pat Conroy, as a cadet, absolutely believed in that. But he found out when he got there that maybe he was alone in that belief, that the administration at the time was engaged in acts that seemed very hypocritical to Pat, and the world seemed very different to Pat as well. It did not seem as though it was keeping in that code of honor, and Pat would write about that, of course, many times in many books. In The Lords of Discipline, which came out in 1980, which is Pat's novel, his fictional version of his college experiences, he assigns a line to General Durrell, who's ultimately one of the villains of the book, but still gets some good lines in about honor and the honor code. And General Durrell says this: "Honor is the presence of God in man." And that's what Cadet Pat Conroy absolutely believed, that by adhering to the honor code of the Citadel, he was honoring his God, his creator. And he wanted to believe in that. And Pat is going to Mass when he's a cadet at the Citadel as well. He's trying very much to stay engaged with his faith, with what he believes his faith is at the time. But he looks out into the world, and he looks out around the Citadel, and he sees people who are doing things that he cannot believe in and he cannot support. He sees hypocrisy and the physical abuses of the plebe system. He sees his classmates going to Vietnam and not coming back. He sees a world where civil rights and gender rights are in jeopardy. Pat is a very liberal-minded, open-minded person. He doesn't see that reflected in the world. But he's optimistic at that point because Vatican II, the Second Ecumenical Council of the Vatican, is going on from 1962 to 1965, so it's overlapping with both part of Pat's high school years and part of his college years. And in Pat's hope, he's seeing the possibility that the Catholic Church will move toward a presentation of their teachings that is more in keeping with his own belief system, that will be a little more liberal and reflective of the times, or Pat's aspiration for the times. But in the end, he doesn't actually see that outcome, and that gives him a sense that perhaps his faith in the Catholic Church is misplaced, and he needs to find another outlet for that. And he writes quite a bit about that later on in a book called My Losing Season, about that period in his life where he was trying very much to hold on to his faith in God through the church, which has always been his conduit to God, but it really wasn't working out for him to the degree that he hoped it would. And I'm going to ask Colin to read the next passage.
Looking up at the night sky, I saw the Milky Way. I instantly thought of God and how afraid I was that I was losing my faith in him, and the immensity of the fear and cowardice I felt when I thought of facing the world without him. I was receiving the Eucharist every day of my life and fighting this war with faithlessness with every cell of my body, but I could feel the withdrawal taking place without my consent.
So Pat is looking for that connectivity to God. He's hoping for it, but he's not finding it in the usual ways. He's not finding it through prayer as he's traditionally carried out prayer. He's not finding it in Mass. He's not finding it in the outcomes of Vatican II. But then suddenly he discovers he is finding it in some other aspect of his life. And all this while, remember, Pat is trying to be a poet. So he's writing, and he's writing, and he's writing. And that starts to take on another meaning for Pat. And I'll ask Colin to read this part, which is also from My Losing Season.
That year, my relationship with God was direct and personal and conversational in nature. I was losing him, and I wanted him to help me. All basketball season long, I would look for signs of his imminence and concern in my daily affairs. I prayed hard and only gradually became aware that this fierce praying was a way of finding prologue and entrance into my own writing. This came as both astonishment and relief. When I thought God had abandoned me, I discovered that he had simply given me a different voice to praise the inexhaustible beauty of the made world.
So think about that for a moment. Pat is trying to find his voice as a writer. He's trying to find his ambitions, putting words on the page, and he starts to realize that the voice he has and the words he's putting on that page are in fact a form of prayer. He's not doing it in the church. He's not doing it as part of a Mass. He's doing it on his own, and it's become more meaningful for him than organized religion at that point. He's finding an outlet that actually works for him, and he's following that path where it's going to lead him. So then the question becomes, great, I'm writing, so I'm praying, but what am I actually praying for? What am I going to do with this voice I'm developing? And he looks out in the world and he sees all of those injustices I have mentioned, the Vietnam War, civil rights movement, the women's rights movement. He looks at his own family and he sees what he went through as a child of abuse. He sees all of these things that someone needs to say something about, and realizes that perhaps he can be that someone. And he writes about that same thought process, that same sort of flipping of the switch for the character Will McLean in the novel The Lords of Discipline, and Will sort of coming into contact with what, until that moment, had been the two great support systems of his life. And I'll ask Colin to read that.
The American South and the Catholic Church. These were the two pillars of authority upon which my life had been built, and I had learned their rituals well. their worship of order and tradition, the strict codes, their punishment of anarchy, and contempt for the man or woman who stood alone. They had not prepared me for a time in my life when I would stand alone.
So that's Will sort of describing this moment where he realizes he's got to take a stand. Even if he's by himself, he's got something to say and he deserves to be heard. And that's Pat as a man in his 30s, remembering what it was like for him as a cadet at the Citadel to be at that same sort of nexus point where things were coming together and he needed to take action or not. And he decided to take action. He decided the tool he had, writing, which again is a form of prayer for Pat Conroy, was going to be the way that he could address godlessness and hypocrisy in the world. And I want to talk a little bit about how Pat does that in a couple of books, just to give you some examples from both his memoirs and his works of fiction. So in Pat's book, The Water is Wide, which is his teaching memoir of being both the first white school teacher and the first male school teacher on Defusky Island, 1969, 1970, he describes an encounter with a minister from Beaufort who, on behalf of his church, was sending books over to Defusky Island, which at that point had a population of, at best, semi-literate people. So this is really doing nobody any particular good. It's checking the generosity box for a church. And in having conversations with this minister, he realizes this church has no intention whatsoever of ever being integrated. In fact, they have a plan of what to do should a person of color ever come to the church. And I'll ask Colin to read that for us as well.
If a black had entered his church, the church would have closed down automatically. That was the plan of the hallowed vestryman should a blackfoot cross the threshold. Christ must do a lot of puking when he reflects upon the good works done in his name.
So Pat is not seeing a lot of godliness in this supposed man of faith, and he's encountering that in a lot of people who are in positions of authority, which had been his experience with the school district, with the administration at the Citadel, sort of over and over again. Pat is finding people who are not in keeping with his vision of what a good leader, a good person should be. And he describes that to some degree in The Prince of Tides as well. And I want to give you a couple examples from that book. The first is a very short exchange between the two twins, Tom and Savannah Wingo. And Savannah Epps is in fact named after Savannah Wingo from The Prince of Tides. So I'm all the more grateful to Savannah for introducing us. But the twins are having this exchange about their relationship with God and how they use prayer. And Savannah says this: I always believe in God when I truly need him. And Tom's response is, situational faith. So in Tom's vision, Savannah is using prayer and God the same way one would use a birthday wish or a letter to Santa Claus, sort of wish fulfillment on an as-needed basis. It's not an interactive relationship. It's very much one-sided and just when she needs something. And that's Tom's way of critiquing that. But they also end up critiquing their grandfather's relationship with God, and that's a character named Amos Wingo, who's very much based on Pat's actual maternal grandfather, so his mother's father, Jasper Peake. And I'll let Holland read this, and I'll say a little more about it.
It did not surprise me one bit that Grandpa Wingo revealed the secret that God himself had appeared to the young Amos Wingo and instructed him to live a life according to the Word. God often honored my grandfather with these chatty, arbitrary visitations throughout his entire life.
So what Amos Wingo is doing is he is writing letters to the editor of the local newspaper in which he describes lengthy conversations that he has with God. And Luke Wingo, the older brother of Tom and Savannah, says, boy, God sure does sound a lot like a redneck when Grandpa describes him. Sounds a lot like Grandpa, in fact. And they end up dismissing Amos Wingo's faith as, in Tom's words, quote, a sweet, uncomplicated craziness. So they don't believe for an instant that their grandfather is actually having this individual, personal dialogue with God. They think wholeheartedly that he's just making it up. And that's their reaction to most of the things that Amos Wingo does to express his faith. They're very dismissive of it. So where is our Pat Conroy finding God in the world, if not in people in moments like that? Well, if you remember the Randy Randall poem that was in so many ways a nature poem, that's where Pat Conroy at a much older point in his life is still finding God in the beauty and wonder of the natural world. So much so that he can even attribute it to godless characters. Also from The Prince of Tides, The father of Luke and the twins, Henry Wingo, who is a man of violence, man of physicality, very much like Pat's father, seemingly a man without any conception of faith, is also able to see the beauty and wonder of God in the natural world. And there's one really wonderful example of that when Henry sees Snow, the albino dolphin, for the very first time. And I'll ask Holland to read that.
Now, if that ain't proof of a living God, then nothing is. That's as beautiful as any creature on earth. But he's still up there, dreaming up things even more beautiful to please man's eye.
If Henry Wingo can see God in a moment like that, then Pat is telling us anyone can. And that's a really small moment, but a really beautiful moment as well. The older brother of the twins, Luke Wingo, has a very strong sense of faith, and he's always been sort of a quiet outsider. But there comes a moment when the whole town is in jeopardy. Colleton, as it's called, which is a fictional stand-in for our very real beloved Beaufort, is about to be sold to the government, who wants to come build an atomic bomb plant in the Lowcountry. And Luke has a chance to address the entire town at a school gymnasium. And this man, this young man who's always been so quiet, suddenly gets up there and takes command of the audience. And his remarks start off kind of personal and awkward, but then he taps into his faith, his true and authentic belief system, and he gives what ultimately is not just a speech, it's a kind of sermon. And Holland will share that with us.
It was while reading the story of creation that it came to me like a vision. Genesis is not a book of revelation, but a book of prophecy. I think it foretells what will happen in the future, not what has happened in the past. And is it so difficult for those who've grown up by the Colleton River and known the beauty of the seasons in the marshes? Is it so difficult for us to imagine that we are still living in paradise and that we have yet to be denied the Garden of Eden? That Adam and Eve are still waiting to be born and that you and I are living in paradise without even knowing it? I have read Genesis, my friends and neighbors, and I think I know the answer. I have prayed to God for wisdom, and I think he has granted that wisdom to me. Genesis is a parable, and it is God reaching out down through the ages to warn the people of Colleton and all the people of the world of one thing that can destroy paradise for all of us. It is not an apple that Eve touched. I think the forbidden fruit is plutonium.
So there's Luke, who has a genuine and true, authentic relationship with God and expresses that beautifully and powerfully in a moment where it might actually do some good for this town. And the twins do not mock this in any way, the way they mocked their grandfather. They are supportive of this because the writer Pat Conroy is supportive of this vision as well, that this place, this Lowcountry that we love so much, is a form of paradise and deserves to be protected. And Pat gives that to Luke as something that he can share in that moment. There's another character in another book who has that same true and authentic relationship with God that is not challenged, and that's the character of Jordan Elliott in the book Beach Music. When we encounter Jordan in the sort of modern day portion of that book, he is a priest, a Trappist monk, in fact, on the run from Interpol, of all things. But when we first encounter him in the flashbacks in the book, he's a surfer kid from California, newly arrived in the Lowcountry. And the local kids are trying to understand what he loves so much about surfing. And this is what he says.
Because surfing makes me feel like I'm in the presence of God. The ocean, the sun, the waves, the beach, the sky. It's like praying without any words.
So there, too, is a character whose faith is never challenged, is indeed supported by the novel and by its writer, Pat Conroy. And once again, he's writing about finding God, finding a communion with the Creator in the beauty and wonder of the natural world, which is something Pat has believed since he was a teenager, since he wrote the Randy Randall poem. Well, I want to give one other example from The Prince of Tides, and it's a bit complicated, but I think worthwhile. There's, for those of you who've read the book and remember it, you know there is a book within a book. The character Savannah Wingo, the twin we've mentioned a couple of times, is repressing traumas from her childhood. And at one point, one of the ways she processes that is by adopting the persona of a recently deceased Jewish friend named Renata Halpern. And as Renata, she writes a children's book called The Southern Way, which is not very kid-friendly for those of you who read it, although it's called a children's book within the context of the novel. And in that book, within a book, Southern Way, the basic plot is that a mother and her 3 daughters live in an isolated cabin, and their father is off somewhere, and 3 bad guys, 3 escaped prisoners, come on the property to do these women harm. And what saves them is that each of these 3 girls has the ability to communicate with certain kinds of animals. And so they ask the animal world, the natural world, for help, for defense. And the animals rush to save them and ultimately dispatch these 3 bad guys. But one of the animals dies in the course of doing that. It's the spider. One of the girls has the ability to talk to insects, and a spider comes up to one of the bad guys, bites him on the neck, gets swatted, and dies. And he knows this is going to happen. The spider knows he is making this kind of life or death sacrifice, but the girls mean so much to him that he's willing to do this. So I'm talking about all of this one night with Nicole Seitz, who is the co-editor of Our Prince of Scribes. And Nicole says to me, well, you know the spider is Pat, right? And I just came to a complete standstill in my thought process. And I said, no, I don't know that. I've never once had that thought before. Explain that to me. So I'm going to ask Colin to read the ending of the story within the story, Southern Way, and then I will explain Nicole's vision for what all of this means.
That evening, they buried the spider in the family cemetery for pets. They prayed for his soul and that his webs would spin out for thousands of miles, connecting planets and stars, and that the angels would sleep in his silk, and that his weavings would always please God.
For much of his writing life, Pat Conroy often referred to writers and storytellers as web spinners, a metaphor that evokes a spider. And here in this moment, we have a spider who's given everything, who's literally given his life to save these kids. And in Nicole's vision, that is Pat Conroy, the writer, speaking through the character Savannah Wingo, who in turn is speaking through Renata Halpern, who is then writing in this story, that's what a writer has to be willing to do, to risk yourself fully and completely if you believe you're going to do some good in this world. And that's what Pat did time and time again by being a truth teller. He knew there was going to be blowback in telling the truth. He knew he was putting himself at risk with family and friends and with people in authority by writing these books, but he also believed wholeheartedly that it mattered. He had faith that the words he was putting on that page would mean something to each and every one of you, so much so that he was willing to risk himself to do it. And that's what happens to this spider, whose weavings, Pat's writings, we hope would always please God. And as Nicole explained all that to me, it made absolute sense to me then. I mean, what a wonderful gift to give me another way of reading that metaphor. And once again, we have Pat responding to the beauty and the wonder of the natural world as the way in which each and every one of us can engage with some sense of a creator. Pat also put this quite succinctly in another book, the Pat Conroy Cookbook, in a chapter in which he's describing his decision as a very young person to adopt Beaufort as his hometown after growing up a military brat and living 23 other places before he came here as a 16-year-old. This ultimately became the place that he was always writing about, always trying to get back to, even during the 20 years he was not a full-time resident. And he wrote about the reason for that, or at least a reason for that, in the cookbook. So I'll ask Colin to read that.
The great salt marsh spreading all around as far as the eye could see has remained the central image that runs through my work. I cannot look at a salt marsh veined with the salt creek swollen with the moonstruck tides without believing in God.
So there it is, once again, Pat Conroy in his own voice now, writing in the cookbook, with absolute certainty that he is able always to find the presence of God in the natural world, but especially the natural world that we live in here in our beloved Lowcountry. He is actually also able to find it in people, not in the authority figures at the Citadel, not in that minister and folks like him that Pat mentioned in The Water is Wide, certainly not in the school district at that time, but in some other interesting folks who are key parts of Pat's life. And one good example of that is Joe Monte, who was Pat's sophomore English teacher in 1960-61 at Gonzaga High School, a Jesuit high school in Washington, D.C. This is the year before the Conroy family moves here to Beaufort, South Carolina. And this is how Pat describes Joe Monte.
Joseph Monte hit me like an ice storm, and I still think that great teacher was sent to me into my life by God, who saw the directionlessness, blemished slide my life was taking in my disfigured household. The great teachers fill you up with hope and shower you with 1,000 reasons to embrace all aspects of life.
So there's Pat Conroy seeing his teacher Joe Monte as effectively a gift from God. At this point in Pat's life, and certainly when he's here in Beaufort as a young person, he's actively trying to find models of adulthood and masculinity in particular that are different than his abusive father. He does not want to grow up to be a man like Don Conroy. He's looking for other role models, and he finds them in men like Joe Monte. So it's easy to understand why Pat, again raised in the Catholic Church, would then interpret that as a kind of gift from God to have a teacher, a guy like Joe Monte, in his life. Joe is 87 this year, still actively involved in teaching, both as a Sunday school teacher and as a member of his local teachers union, as he has been for a long, long time. Fascinating man who's lived a life of service, and Pat would view that as being godly, certainly. But Pat also found that in several folks at Beaufort High School as well. I mentioned Gene Norris earlier, his high school English teacher, but he also saw it in Bill Duffert, his high school principal, and I'll ask Colin to share that passage.
To Bill Duffert, education was as holy a profession as the priesthood. It was one of his greatest gifts that he could convey his sense of mission about education to the kids who came under his jurisdiction. A whole tribe of us went into teaching because of his influence.
It's probably true that multiple hundreds of people became teachers because of Bill Duffert, not just Pat Conroy. Duffert had a career in public education as a great figure integrating high schools across this state for about 40 years, and he's been honored for that many, many times. When he was Pat Conroy's principal, he was still trying to work out crossing that threshold into believing in civil rights. He was having some challenges with it, but Pat talked him through part of that. Even as a young person, that's the kind of influence Pat had. And Duffert became this great role model for Pat. And it's easy to understand why Pat, who had been going to Catholic schools until this point, would see that man who wants to live a life of service, a good-hearted, kind man, as being priest-like, as he describes Bill Duffert. Another one of Bill Duffert's students from Sumter High School gave a presentation at Newberry College, which is where Duffert graduated from, and said at one point that if any of Bill Duffert's students ever tell you that Dr. Duffert was the second most important man of their childhood, then they're just being kind to their fathers. That's the kind of guy Bill Duffert is to this day, 93 years old and still actively involved in education as well. Remarkable figure. And Pat is seeing folks like this, folks who are choosing to live a life of service as being godly in their way, as being the kind of figures that he wished he was seeing everywhere, but is finding at least in a handful of his teachers. There's another example, too, and that is from the Citadel. When Pat is there as a college student, he comes under the mentorship of the Boo, Colonel Corvese, who is the Commandant of Cadets, and Pat will write his very first book in defense of the Boo when the Boo is demoted. And in that book, he has a great line, which Holland is going to read for us now.
To suggest that the Boo was bad for discipline was like proposing that a belief in God was inimical to prayer. The Boo was synonymous with discipline to the cadets of my generation.
Very well done.
Thanks.
Yes. We were betting whether or not she could pronounce a word in the middle of that passage. She totally nailed it. It's great. Yes. So Pat is seeing in these teachers men who have decided a way to practice faith outside of the church. They have found an individualistic approach, a way that does good in their community and certainly for their students. And Pat wants to live a life like that. He wants to do something that is an individualistic expression of his own faith, which writing ultimately becomes. Well, he has a wonderful dialogue about that very thing, about feeling a sort of disconnect with organized religion and with the way you've practiced your faith up until this moment, and trying to reach a level of comfort with finding your own path. And that dialogue happens in beach music. It's between our narrator, Jack McCall, who's sort of the fictional version of Pat Conroy, and that surfer boy we saw earlier, Jordan Elliott, who at this point is Father Jordan Elliott, a Trappist monk. And Holland and I are going to try and read this together, which is exciting. We've never done it this way before. So I will start, and this is Father Elliott. This is Jordan Elliott speaking to Jack about losing his faith. God's patient, Jack. He'll wait.
No, he won't. He doesn't exist. At least not for me, he doesn't.
That's not true. He exists for all of us in different ways.
Prove to me that there's a God.
Prove to me there's not one.
That's not much of an answer.
It's not much of a question either.
At least try. Tell me about the beauty of the sunsets or the grand designs of snowflakes. Tell me in words, no matter how stupid or silly, why you believe in God. Jordan sighed. I knew his own faith had stalked him through days and nights of despair, and when it finally chose to pounce, he was ready for it and let himself be devoured like a lamb. Readiness is the opening God needs, I thought, as I listened to my friend.
Jack, the wing of a fly is proof enough of the existence of God for me.
I've lost the gift of faith. I used to have it, but I lost it, and I can't seem to get it back. I don't even know if I want it back. I've forgotten how to pray.
You're praying now, Jack. You're on a quest. It takes different forms with all of us. So those are two characters, Jordan Elliott and Jack McCall, trying to hash it out. But ultimately, that's the writer Pat Conroy trying to talk to himself and give himself permission to practice his faith in any way he chooses. And for Pat, writing that book is a form of prayer. It is an act of faith. Here's another really good example of Pat trying to take a more individualistic approach to practicing his faith. And this is from his very first novel. This is from The Great Santini, which ends, not to ruin it for those of you who haven't read it, including Holland, but with the death of the title character, the Great Santini, and his teenage son, Ben Meacham, who's a stand-in for Pat Conroy, is trying to reconcile this, the absence of his father, the absence of his abusive father, who is a hero, who has died heroically, but he lived a life in which he was physically and verbally abusive to the whole family. And now Ben, who is a person of faith, is not sure what to do with that, and he wants very much to talk to God about that, but he's not sure he can. So this is from the closing of The Great Santini.
Ben Meacham wanted to pray, but he was afraid he was not worthy of prayer. But he was even more afraid that he had no belief in prayer. Yet he had belief in wonder. Can a boy begin a prayer with hatred of his father in his heart? Can that boy walk up to the altar of God, and can he lay that hatred out? Can he spew his hate and tell his story? Can he tell about beatings and humiliations? Can he tell of the Marine who stormed the beaches of his childhood? Can he look into the eye of God and spit into that purest source of life for engendering his soul in the seed of a father who did not know the secret of tenderness, a father who loved in strange, undecipherable ways, a father who did not know how to love, a father who did not know how to try? And what would this God be like, this God of Ben Meacham, this God that Ben was losing fast and barely believed in? Ben thought about the kind of God he would approach, that the God would have to look a certain way. And in his mind, Ben began to assemble the God that he would speak to about his father. This would be the God of Ben Meacham. Ben would give him the sweetness of Lillian, the dark, honest eyes of Arabelle, the soft virility of Mr. Dacus, and the birthmark of Pinky on his throat, and Ogden Loring's upcountry drawl. Ben would give him the shoulders of Virgil Hedgepath, the innocence of Karen, the spoon and tears of Mary Ann, the high-pitched laugh of Sammy, Matt's intensity, and the loyalty of the Gray. And Ben would put his God on a street like River Street, and he would have this God lift his voice in the holy song of Toomer. The hands of this God would be bright with flowers that would never die, and this God would sing and stutter and limp along an alleyway and pass judgment in the land beside the river. He would hold mercy in a bouquet of azaleas, and he would listen to Ben.
So what Ben is doing in that scene, and therefore what the writer Pat Conroy is doing in that scene, is an inversion of a lesson we are often told in church and Sunday school and in lots of environments, that we are made in the image of God, of our Creator. All of those characters that Holland just mentioned are all of the good people in Ben's life. So when Ben needs to envision what his God looks like, what he hopes his God is, he constructs his God out of the best parts of all of the good people in his life, the most godly aspects of those people. So he's reversing the thought process. He is making a God in the image of all of the best parts of the good people in his life. And it's a beautiful, wonderful, lyrical passage in this book that ultimately is not that lyrical anywhere else. This is Pat Conroy trying to grapple with his own faith in these closing passages and writing in a style that he hadn't written in before, but ultimately becomes the way that he'll write many of his future books, pretty much from Prince of Tides onward, we'll get this kind of lyrical style, but in the Great Santini, we only get it in this moment. And once again, Pat Conroy, that kid who grew up wanting to be a poet and deciding that poetry was a form of prayer, is praying in this moment, trying to create a vision of God that works for him. Beautifully read, by the way. Nice job with that, yes. So what does Pat decide with all of this prayer? What can he hinge his belief system on? Ultimately, it comes around to a symbol and a process and a sort of repetition that Pat encounters over and over and over again throughout his life. And he calls it the circle, a symbol that has its history in many religions, certainly in Christianity as well. And to give it a little context, we'll share a couple of examples from Pat's writing, but also a few from Pat's life, and maybe one or two from our own lives as well. So to go back to the Prince of Tides, where we spent quite a bit of time, because that's very much a book of faith, if you pay attention to the structure of that novel and the relationship between the siblings, the Wingo siblings, older brother Luke, and then twins Tom and Savannah, the book begins and ends with a circle. And those of you who have seen the movie will certainly remember this moment when we're introduced to the kids for the first time. They're running down a pier, they jump into the water, they sink below the water, and they each hold hands. They're forming a circle in the water, rising and falling together. Really beautiful visual moment that Pat describes perfectly, and Holland's going to read that passage.
We floated together, our hands clasped in a perfect, unbreakable circle. I held Savannah's hand, and I held Luke's. All of us touched, bound in a ring of flesh and blood and water.
So there's the opening circle with all three siblings represented. By the time we get to the end of the novel, we have just the twins remaining. And Savannah, who has lived through all of this repressed trauma, and thanks to Brother Tom, her storyteller, her memory keeper, if you will, she's been able to return herself to an authentic vision of herself, an almost childlike and innocent version of herself, despite everything that's happened to her. That's the gift that Tom has been able to give to her through the course of the novel. And he asks her if she's going to be okay, and when she answers him, she evokes the circle one more time.
I'm going to make it. Wholeness, Tom. It all comes back. It's all a circle.
We see this a few times. It's certainly true in South of Broad as well, where the character Leo King talks about circles quite a bit, and they are for him very much as they are for the Wingo siblings, a sort of way of thinking about the world, trying to get back to an earlier version of yourself and then go around the next cycle as your true self, your forgotten, your lost self. And Leo says at one point, I developed an eye for circles and the strange power they exert over human connections. And Pat, in his own voice, evokes this very thing in his book, The Death of Santini, when he talks very specifically about the importance of circles.
In my novels, I've often written about the immense and mysterious powers I associate with the perfect shape of a circle. When my past circles back on me and completes itself in my present life, it often seems both covert and ominous, acting as both herald and sign. The circle almost always takes me by surprise, leaving me breathless and in awe.
So here's an example of that unfolding in the real lived experiences of Pat Conroy, and it takes place in a Presbyterian church, just not this one. This is a story from First Pres of Beaufort, which became Pat Conroy's second church, as he called it. And remember, he was raised Roman Catholic, but Randy Randall's parents, Julia and Morgan, became very dear to Pat Conroy because of Pat's relationship with Randy, and they became sort of an adoptive family for Pat. And Pat would actually go to services at First Pres with Morgan and Julia. And when Morgan passed away, Pat was asked to give a eulogy for his friend, his mentor in some ways, his surrogate father in other ways. And Pat gave a beautiful eulogy of that, which I did not see until after the first time I gave this talk. And one of Pat's teachers, Grace Dennis, came into my office one day and said, well, I'm sure you've seen Pat's eulogy for Morgan Randall. And I said, no, I've actually never seen that. And she handed it to me, and I read it, and I wanted to be Morgan Randall. I missed Morgan Randall, a man who I'd never known because of the beauty and power of Pat's eulogy. There are people to this day who are mad at Pat Conroy for dying first because he will never be able to give a eulogy for them. That's how powerful Pat Conroy's eulogies are. And this is an excerpt from Pat's eulogy for Morgan, which he would have delivered in 1999. And I share this not just because it reflects well on Morgan Randall, who sounds like an amazing human being, but also because it tells us very much about Pat Conroy's faith in that moment, what he believed that Morgan had done, and that indeed each of us should try and do in our way. So this is from Pat's otherwise unpublished eulogy for Morgan Randall, 1999, delivered at First Pres of Beaufort. Here's how to live a good life. Do it like Morgan Randall. Choose a profession. Make it service to your community. Teach, coach, let it count. Shape the world you live in. Be so good at it that everyone sees the leader in you. People look to you for guidance and direction. Come to Beaufort High School as principal. Grow legendary. Grow beloved. Grow essential. Become superintendent. Shape the lives of every student north of the Broad River. Choose a church. Make it a good one. Make it this one. Join a choir. This one will do fine. Shape your life into a hymn of praise to God. Teach the children of Beaufort well. Cherish your family and worship your God with every living cell of your body. This is what your life was meant to be, Morgan Randall, and you lived it splendidly, surpassingly well. In an age when God must wonder if he did the right thing in creating mankind, he can always say, that guy in Beaufort, Morgan Randall, that's how it was supposed to be. He did it like I planned. Morgan Randall, now there's a man, a real man, in my image. It's a beautiful, powerful eulogy, and what a gift given from Grace Dennis. But that is in fact not our only First Pres story, is it, Holland?
No, it is not. So, like Mr. Haupt said, Pat Conroy would often visit his second church, First Pres, with his friend Julia Randall. And one of the times he visited, he sat down behind this really cute little family. There was only 3 of them, a beautiful mother and 2 little kids, like 6 or 7, a brother and a sister, and they were laughing and having a great time, and the mom was talking to everyone around her, and they were all very happy. But Pat Conroy looked around and watched the other families walking in, and it wasn't just a mom and her kids, it was a dad, a mom, and their kids. And this might have struck a chord with him because of his own life, because his father also wouldn't come to church with them because he would be out at war. So for some reason, this resonated with him a whole lot. And he turned to Julia and he said, "Where's that deadbeat dad of theirs?" And the senior pastor goes walking down the center aisle to go up to the pulpit to preach, and she points and laughs, and she says, "That would be him. He's up there preaching." So that guy sitting right over there, that's my dad, and we were that family. But that was my only time meeting Pat Conroy. So that's my little circle, and it's pretty amazing to me how important he has become in my life, even in his passing, through the center and through Mr. Haupt. It's a pretty amazing circle for me, so.
That's Holland's point of entrance into the circle, which she continues to occupy. When Holland reached about the same age that Pat Conroy was when he came to Beaufort, 16-year-old kid, actually a little younger than that, right? 14? 14, yes. 14. She started having the same kind of ambitions that Pat had, wanting to be a writer, wanting to find mentors and opportunities. And there was no Bill Duffert, there was no Jean Norris, there was no Ann Head, who was Pat Conroy's first creative writing teacher. But there was a Pat Conroy Literary Center, and there was me. And for 3 wonderful, irreplaceable years, I have gotten to be Holland's mentor and see her grow into the amazing person that she is right now. And it's an honor to share this story and this time with her. I mentioned Ann Head, and that's well worth circling back around, to use the obvious metaphor. At the time that Pat Conroy was a student at Beaufort High School, Ann Head was one of the best-known Southern writers there was, and that's a name that's perhaps not that familiar to any of you right now. She's sort of been lost to the passage of time, but she was writing short stories and novels in serialized form that were being published in all the major literary magazines of her day, which was amazing in the 1950s and 1960s for a woman from a small town in Beaufort, South Carolina, to be able to make a living on the national stage as a writer. So when Jean Norris realized that Pat Conroy had the potential to be a writer, not just the ambition to do it, but the potential to do it, and there were several other kids at Beaufort High who were in that same category, Jean recruited Ann to be the first creative writing teacher that Beaufort High ever had, and it was transformative for Pat to have this writer from the larger world of publishing sort of open the doors to the house of fiction and welcome young Pat Conroy in. And that's what I get to do for Holland now. But Anne's daughter, Nancy Thody, who's become a great friend to me, decided a few years ago that she wanted to honor her mother at Beaufort High, and particularly her mother's relationship, mentoring Pat Conroy. So she created the Anne Head Literary Prize for short fiction. And the first year it was offered, Holland was a finalist for that award. And the second year, Holland won that award. So there's that circle from Anne Head, who is Pat Conroy's mentor, to Pat, to me, who was mentored by Pat Conroy, to Holland, who I get to mentor, all the way back around now to Anne Head. Isn't that remarkable? Things like that happened in Pat's life all the time. It happens so often that you kind of miss it on the day that you don't notice it, and you just sort of assume it happened and you didn't see it, because there is that regularity to it if you open yourself up to the possibility of seeing those connections and seeing them as coming as part of someone else's plan for how that circle should spin around us and how we should be involved in it. So Pat Conroy had an opportunity to talk about all of the things that we've been talking about in an interview he did in 2013 for the Minnesota Public Radio. It was a public forum in front of an audience, and the host asked him sort of an unscripted question about whether or not he still considered himself a Catholic. And Pat gave a really wonderful off-the-cuff response, and I want to share this for you as we near the end of our time here. So this is from the 2013 version of Pat Conroy, who in context passed away in 2016. So this is 3 years before Pat died. And he said this to the host in response to her question. You know, I've been a very bad Catholic. I've come to the point where I just don't agree with much the church teaches. But as I tell every priest I ever met, I think I'm as good a Catholic as you are. When they ask me why, I say, well, first of all, I'm having a better season than you guys are. But it's not like I've left being a Catholic. You don't leave being a Catholic. It's like being Jewish or being black or being a Citadel man. You don't leave that. I'm going to die a Catholic. I've got this priest who says he'll hear my last confession, and he's going to schedule 7 days before I die so I can do it. Later in that same interview, Pat becomes a little more serious, and he echoes quite a lot that we've been saying in our time here. And he comes down to this. This is what he arrives at in response to that question. I have a strong sense of faith, and I put that sense of faith in my books. Instead of prayer, I write novels. That faith comes through me in the books I write as I try to celebrate God's worlds and how pretty it is. So that's Pat Conroy, 67 years old at that point, really saying definitively that writing novels in particular, is a form of prayer for him. This is what he has learned as his individualistic faith. Another Catholic writer who Pat very much would have been familiar with and probably enamored with at one point, Flannery O'Connor, wrote very much the same thing in her story, The Enduring Chill, when she says simply, the artist prays by creating. That is a one-for-one parallel with Pat Conroy's statement. Well, in that interview, Pat Conroy said he was going to die a Catholic, and true to his word, he did exactly that. There was a Catholic Mass for Pat's funeral at St. Peter's, but he's not buried in a Catholic cemetery. He's actually buried in what would traditionally have been a Gullah cemetery, an African-American Baptist cemetery on St. Helena Island. And it took very special permission for Pat to do that. And people often ask, why did he do that? Why is he effectively integrating a cemetery? And we've come to accept it as Pat Conroy's last act as a teacher. And remember, he saw teachers as being godly as well, folks like Joe Monte and Bill Dufford. So Pat very much wanted to emulate that throughout his life and ended up emulating it at his death as well. You can't get to Pat's gravesite on St. Helena without going through Penn Center and having a chance to learn a little something about that. And when Pat was a young person, when Pat was a teenager, his teacher, G. Norris, would take him out to Penn Center. And in the 1960s, the late 1960s, Penn was one of the few places in the country where blacks and whites could safely gather together. And so it became a hub, a haven, if you will, of activity around the civil rights movement. And while Pat was out there, about the same age Holland is now, he met Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Julian Bonds and Jesse Jackson and all the wonderful leaders of that movement. And that helped shape Pat's view of equality and inclusivity and all of those things that he came to believe in and write about over time. And the way our Conroy Center honors that is that we created a March 4th event. Pat passed away on the 4th day of March. so literally March 4th. And the Conroy Center, on the first anniversary of Pat's death, created an event in partnership with Penn Center where we would honor that day, not with a day of mourning, but with a day of education, honoring Pat's last act as a teacher. And we've been able to bring out a remarkable group of writers to talk about key themes of Pat's life, including civil rights and social justice and conservation and education and storytelling and all of these wonderful things as an act of faith, and as well as an act of faith that it would be meaningful to someone, that it may even be transformative to someone. And one of those someones is standing next to me. So you want to share your March 4th story?
I do. I'm going to do an abridged version because this is a long story. It's kind of like my story right now. I'm writing my college essays about it. That's how important this was to me. But when I was a freshman at Beaufort High School, Nick Stone came to speak with us. She wrote Dear Martin and Dear Justice and a bunch of other books, all of which deal with racism and police brutality in one way or another. And when she came and spoke to us, I was so impacted, and it stuck with me just how much she was putting her life forth to improve the lives of others and tell her story. So I then, a couple months later, came in for an interview for an internship that did not exist at the Pat Conroy Literary Center. And I began to go to events, and I got to do introductions, and I got to meet a bunch of writers who were also trying to change the world. So all of this was happening, and it sort of came to a pinnacle point during the midst of COVID and the Black Lives Matter movement in 2020. We had the pleasure of Anika Noni Rose. She's a Disney princess. She voiced Tiana in The Princess and the Frog. We had her Zoom in with us for an event for March 4th, to clarify, for another March 4th. And she gave a wonderful talk along with some other panelists. But the final thing that really stuck with me of what she said was, do that work yourself. And she was talking to white people, saying that the Black people carry the burden all the time that we will never understand, and that it is our job to do the work yourself, to make the difference and to fight the fight. So she said that. I went home and I was like crying to my parents because I was like, oh my God, I have to do the work myself. Like, I need to start something. And my parents were like, no, please just graduate. Like, she wasn't talking to you, like, calm down. But I didn't listen to them. And instead, a month later, I was in front of my school administration proposing an idea called DALO, the Diversity Awareness Youth Literacy Organization. So the things I'm kind of trying to combine here are storytelling and social justice, because I believe that empathy is created through storytelling in one of the most powerful ways that can be. So that is the way that my circle has really come all the way around from March 4th as a freshman, 14-year-old me, all the way to now, where we are doing events with really, really cool authors and doing book drives and doing read-alouds with little kids and all sorts of other things that we're really excited about continuing. So that is my really big, good circle that I got from all of this.
And it's an honor and a pleasure to get to support Holland and all of those amazing kids who are investing their time and their energy and their aspirations in DALO. And we've gotten to do a couple of public events with them already, but we will be including them in next March 4th also, but in between now and then, DALO, some of the DALO students and authors that I've recruited specifically because I think it's going to be valuable to their experiences will be part of our annual Pat Conroy Literary Festival, which comes up first weekend in November 4th through the 7th. And we'll be back here as part of that festival as well, back here on Sunday, November 7th, same time, 4 p.m., with our friend and part-time Bluffton resident, Patty Callahan, who will be talking about her new book, Once Upon a Wardrobe. So that's our circle that brings us here today, and will bring us back here one more time, November 7th, and I hope you all come join us for that. So what we want to do in closing, ideally, is read this letter from Pat Conroy that we got effectively from beyond the grave. We got, I mentioned Pat Conroy's grave site, which is in sort of ways his last act as a teacher, but he gave us another sort of last act as a teacher as well, and it was a letter that Pat Conroy wrote originally in 1968, and it was lost to time, but it was found in 2016 after Pat Conroy had passed away, a few months after he had passed away, in the fall of 2016. And in 1968, Pat Conroy was a first-year teacher at Beaufort High School. He was stepping into the life he thought he was always going to live And he wanted to write a letter to one of his mentors, a surrogate father in some ways, Bill Duffert, that high school principal that we mentioned, who had inspired Pat Conroy to become a teacher. And that letter, that 1968 letter, is very much about that. Pat hasn't been to Defusky Island. He hasn't been fired. None of those things have happened to him yet. He thinks he's a teacher who's always going to be a teacher, and he wants to write an earnest letter of gratitude to his mentor. So that's one element of that letter. But in October of 2016, when we found the letter, and when it was given to us, first by Bill Duffert's archivist at Newberry College, and then to Bill Duffert, who, as I mentioned, is still around, and Duffert shared it with us, it seemed like it was very much Pat talking to us in the moment that we were in fall of 2016, which was when we were about to open our Conroy Center to the public for the very first time, about to announce that what had begun as Pat's 70th birthday party, the Pat Conroy at 70 Festival, would continue annually as our literary festival, as it does to this day, and about to announce that I would leave the University of South Carolina Press, where I was publisher, to become the first director of the Conroy Center. And somehow it seemed that 23-year-old Pat Conroy had written about all of those things in 1968. It is a beautiful, powerful, extraordinary letter. We'd like to read it to you, but I see we're out of time. Thank you all for coming. Have a safe drive home. Why you all still sitting there? Do you want to hear the letter? I thought you might. So this is it. This is young teacher Pat Conroy writing to Bill Duffert. I have never understood the dynamics of hero worship. Maybe it was the discovery of the Father I never had as a youth and finally found in you. Father who was not only stern but tender, Father of both the storm and the sun. It is important for you to know this effect you have had, and I believe you know it. But in the shortness and horrible brevity of life, I want to get everything said. Everything. Someday, I'll exert the same influence over someone, and I want him or her to tell me.
This is immortality. For what I have learned from you, I will pass on, and it will be passed on, and it will be passed on, and passed on.
That is a beautiful, powerful sentiment from a young teacher to a slightly older teacher who set him on the path. But that's also Pat Conroy's message to all of us in this moment right now. That last sentence that Holland read for us is effectively the mission statement of our Pat Conroy Literary Center. That's what we get to do every day, and what we've been doing up here for the last hour. We have taken the lessons that Pat learned from his teachers and shared with his students and his readers, and we've now entrusted them to you because we have faith that you will take them and see that they're passed on and passed on and passed on. So with that said, we're very grateful to all of you for your time and your attention this afternoon, and we really appreciate you being here with us to share this time and this space. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.